In this final section, we are going to change gears and talk about some of the practices that can offer solutions to the problems that are posed by conventional agriculture, which is the collection of more traditional agricultural practices that came out of the Green Revolution. So, monoculture, pesticide use, synthetic fertilizers, all of these things have provided benefits, but they've also created problems. So, what are some answers to those problems? That is what this section is dedicated to discussing. So, alternative agriculture describes agricultural practices that deviate from the conventional methods that were developed during the Green Revolution. There are two main schools of alternative agriculture, and those are organic agriculture and conservation agriculture. The priority of organic agriculture is to avoid the application of synthetic chemicals to crops. So, synthetic pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and other chemicals are prohibited for something to be considered organically grown. Organic agriculture also prohibits the cultivation of GMO crops. And then in conservation agriculture, the priority is mainly soil health. So, there are three tenets that support this priority. First, achieving minimal disturbance to the soil by reducing the amount of tilling or by not tilling at all, because tilling disturbs the soil ecosystem and diminishes its ability to retain the nutrients and beneficial organisms that contribute to crop health. And it also exacerbates soil erosion. Secondly, maintaining permanent soil cover by allowing the cropland to always remain covered by crop residues, meaning leftover plant debris, or by planting a cover crop in between growing seasons. And by preventing the soil from becoming barren and exposed, the water retention of the soil is improved, the texture and compaction of the soil is improved, and the amount of organic matter, which can then decay and serve as a natural source of fertilizer, is also improved. And then finally, crop rotation is encouraged as part of the practice of conservation agriculture, meaning not growing the same crop on the same plot of land season after season, but rather rotating through a variety of different crops. So, as you can see, two distinct schools of thought, two distinct approaches, both with their own priorities and their own merits. And each one permits things that the other does not. Another important point. So, for example, in organic agriculture, tilling is fine, and monocropping rather than crop rotation is also fine, whereas those things are not part of the practice of conservation agriculture. And conversely, in conservation agriculture, you can use pesticides and fertilizers and GMOs, which are prohibited in organic agriculture. However, one thing that these approaches share in common is that they both lead to improved biodiversity and have a lower environmental impact compared to the conventional agricultural methods. So, next, we're going to take a look at some specific practices that might be part of one or both of these alternative agriculture approaches. One of these is integrated pest management. The goal of integrated pest management is to reduce the use of chemical pesticides by, first of all, relying as much as possible on non chemical pest control measures, keeping pest organisms at low levels that don't cause much damage rather than aiming to totally eradicate them. And then finally, using pesticides judiciously when necessary as a last resort in a way that avoids harming beneficial insects, humans, and the environment. So, really, integrated pest management means using all the tools that are available to you in your toolbox to prevent the need for chemical pesticides. And some of these tools might be forms of genetic control, like selecting varieties of crop plants that have some sort of natural pest resistance to them. It could also be behavioral control, so things like pheromone traps that attract insects using artificial pheromones. Biological control would include things like ensuring you have a healthy soil cropland ecosystem that's full of beneficial organisms that can serve as natural predators to the pests. And then, if you really do need to use chemical control, chemical pesticides, treat them as a last resort and be very careful about which pesticides you choose to use and how you apply them in order to do it in a way that minimizes the ecological consequences and health blowback to humans. Let's take a moment and talk a little bit more about one of these things, biological control and how it works. So biological control methods utilize one species to reduce the population of a different species. It basically takes advantage of natural predator-prey relationships so that organisms, mostly insects that prey on other insects or weeds, can do the pest control work for you. And this is a growing area of pest control with many instances where it's already being used successfully, such as using ladybugs to reduce aphid populations. Ladybugs are a natural predator of aphids. And if you've ever been in the garden section of a hardware store or a nursery in the springtime and you see these little cups or bags of live ladybugs for sale, that is what their purpose is, to release in your garden and kill aphids. Other use cases include parasitic wasps being released to reduce moth populations, using Bacillus thuringiensis or BT bacteria to reduce mosquito and moth larvae, using leaf beetles to go after a weed called purple loosestrife. And there's other use cases as well. The goal in all of these cases is not to eradicate the pest, but to knock down their population to levels that don't have a economically significant impact on the harvest of the crop. Another alternative agriculture approach that can improve pest control, as well as other factors, is called intercropping or polyculture. Intercropping is the practice of growing two or more crops in close proximity to each other for all or part of their life cycle. And it is an alternative to monoculture that improves the biodiversity of the local ecosystem. It improves soil health, and it makes pest management easier because when you only grow one thing in one enormous plot, you have created a seamless smorgasbord for pests that like to eat that plant. So pest outbreaks can be reduced or better controlled when you use intercropping or polyculture. It's also possible to choose to intercrop plants that have very specific mutually beneficial effects towards one another. And when this occurs on a farm level, it's called intercropping, but when it occurs on a garden level, it's called companion planting. And if you're a gardener, the Old Farmer's Almanac website has a great companion planting chart that you can look up with a list of symbiotic plant pairs and an explanation of the benefit of planting them together. And this here is a snippet of that chart. One example is that tomato and basil can be planted together because basil has a deterrent effect against certain pests, including the hornworm, which is a predator of tomatoes. Another approach to facilitating improved biodiversity and avoiding the pitfalls that come with monoculture is crop rotation. And this is where, rather than growing multiple different plants at the same time alongside each other, multiple different crop plants are grown in sequence in the same field. And crop rotation has several benefits. It improves soil nutrient levels because not every plant has the exact same nutritional requirements. If you only grow one plant, and for example, that plant is a very heavy nitrogen user, then the soil becomes depleted of nitrogen more easily. Whereas if you grow several different plants with different nutritional profiles, then you don't run as great of a risk of depleting the soil. Crop rotation also interrupts pest life cycles. If you monocrop tomatoes, for example, every year the tomato hornworm larvae will hatch and feed on your tomatoes, but if they hatch one year and you're growing corn instead, their source of nutrition is missing and their life cycle gets interrupted. And this works the same way for plant diseases, fungi and bacteria that can infect plants as well. Crop rotation also has an economic benefit. It can allow farmers to diversify what they are growing and thereby reduce their economic risk. Because if you're only growing corn and it's a bad year for corn, then you're all in on a bad thing. Where if you grow a variety of crops and one of them has a bad year, then your downside risk is smaller. The last alternative ag practice that we'll talk about is reduced tillage. So tilling is the practice of plowing and breaking up the topsoil to prepare it for cultivation. And it's common in conventional agriculture because the use of heavy machinery on the land causes soil to become compacted. And compaction in the soil is a bad thing because it reduces the ability of plant roots to penetrate the soil and grow properly. It also makes the soil less hospitable for beneficial organisms like earthworms, for example. And it impedes water infiltration into the soil and promotes erosion, which can lead to nutrient issues. So, in alternative agriculture, tillage can either be reduced in what's called a minimal tillage method or completely eliminated in what's called a no tillage method. And these methods aren't appropriate for all soil types, but when done properly, they can lead to improved soil health and greater productivity. So much of what we just described as being alternative agricultural practices also support the goals of a related concept, which is sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture was defined in the 1990 Farm Bill as an integrated system of plant and animal production practices having site specific application that will, over the long term, satisfy human food and fiber needs, enhance environmental quality and the natural resource base upon which agricultural economy depends, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources and on-farm resources, and integrate where appropriate natural biological cycles and controls, sustain the economic viability of farm operations, and enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. And if you remember back to chapter 1 when we talked about the three pillars of sustainability being environment, economy, and society, you can see all three of these pillars built into the goals that Congress laid out for making our agricultural system sustainable. And we certainly have not met those goals, but on many of these points, conditions have improved as alternative agricultural practices have become more widely adopted. There are still challenges and barriers faced in developing a sustainable agricultural system, though. Most of this is because alternative agricultural practices tend to be more costly to carry out and can be associated with a lower yield. So, organic sources of fertilizers such as manure and worm castings are more expensive than synthetic fertilizers. And also, integrated pest management approaches are more complex and more expensive than synthetics. These higher costs associated with these things then translate to a higher cost of products in the grocery store, which limits the market for these products to people who can afford them. Alternative agricultural practices also tend to generate lower yield. Non-GMO crop varieties generally have lower yield than GMO varieties, and for this reason and others, organically raised crops have been found to have, on average, 19% lower yield compared to conventional agricultural approaches. The no-tillage method, which is part of conservation agriculture, has also been found to produce a 5% lower yield on average compared to conventional agriculture. Nonetheless, alternative and sustainable agriculture are both still on the rise despite of these challenges, which is a positive thing for both human health and environmental health and meeting those sustainability goals for our agricultural system in the country.